Welcome to NCD's ADA 35th Anniversary Briefing Series, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. This is the sixth and final webinar in a series that NCD's been offering on the topic of ground transportation and expanding transportation options for people with mobility disabilities. I'm Ann Summers, the Director of Legislative Affairs and Outreach at the National Council on Disability, and I'm glad to be your presenter today on behalf of the Council. Many individuals, including some of you joining the webinar today, contributed information to NCD for this report, and we are so grateful. All of your input made for an incredibly comprehensive view of this topic for policymakers. On July 23rd, NCD published our report, Ground Transportation for People with Mobility Disabilities 2025, Challenges and Progress. And since then, we have held this briefing series to discuss key findings and recommendations from the different chapters in our report. In our first week, we provided an overview of the significant transportation disadvantages of millions of people with mobility disabilities, and especially those who use motorized wheelchairs and scooters. We discussed how our research showed that people with travel-limiting disabilities were far less likely to own a vehicle, have access to a vehicle, and to drive than people without disabilities, enabling a generationally impactful cycle of poverty, lower employment levels, and social capital and network deficits. During week 2, we turned our attention to transportation network companies, or TNCs, like Uber and Lyft. And we explained how, despite their incredible growth over the last 10 years and hundreds of millions of rides that they provide each year, less than 4% of regions in which Ubers or Lyfts operate provide wheelchair accessible vehicles, or WAVs. And even where wheelchair accessible Lyfts and Ubers are available, the service is often far from comparable to service provided to the general public in terms of hours of availability, wait times, drivers' attitudes, and sometimes additional fees. On week 3, we discussed the availability of wheelchair accessible taxis and how the growth of TNCs like Uber and Lyft, and later the COVID pandemic, hit the taxi industry very hard. And along with it, fleets of taxis with wheelchair accessible taxis in them. We shared several cities that had approached different models to increase the availability of those wheelchair accessible taxis, and how it requires a combination of mandates plus incentives with established funding plus enforcement mechanisms to make a lasting impact on this critical part of the transportation landscape for people with mobility disabilities. On week 4, we focused discussion on the imminent need for autonomous vehicle companies to develop and manufacture wheelchair accessible AVs. AVs have long been recognized as a mode of transportation that could solve the transportation challenges of millions of people with disabilities, especially people with mobility disabilities. However, autonomous vehicles must be purposefully designed to be accessible to all people, as they are not automatically accessible to people with mobility disabilities. It is up to AV technology companies, automobile manufacturers, and federal policymakers to ensure that accessibility is not an afterthought, but instead accessibility is incorporated at the design phase of developing AV technologies. Additionally, we mentioned that the Department of Transportation has preferred guidance to regulation on this emerging industry. We also discussed a macroeconomic analysis conducted by the National Disability Institute, which found that accessible autonomous vehicles would create enormous economic benefit for the United States and could lead to upwards of 4.4 million new jobs for people with disabilities, 9.2 million jobs to support those jobs, and hundreds of billions in income, growth in domestic product, and nearly 100 billion in federal tax revenue. For that reason, we emphasized that in addition to being the right thing to do, the dollars and cents of creating a wheelchair accessible autonomous vehicle speaks for itself. Then last week, we discussed paratransit, the traditional transportation option for people with disabilities, and efforts to improve this service for wheelchair users. We highlighted the more than 30-year-long complaints with paratransit services that people with mobility disabilities have experienced nationwide, and resulting from paratransit's rigid scheduling requirements, like the 24-hour advance reservation requirement, the early and late pickup windows, and lengthy amounts of time that a passenger regularly must endure in order to get to their destination. We then highlighted the evolution of alternative models like microtransit, which has been used to supplement or even replace fixed route bus service, and that additional funding is desperately needed to support these on-demand, technology-enabled transit systems that are wheelchair accessible and are able to route vehicles based on real-time passenger demands and spontaneous travel. Today, as we close out this 6-part briefing series, we will focus our discussion on the accessibility barriers that people with mobility disabilities experience with shuttle service and rental cars, along with NCD's recommendations on ways to improve these services for wheelchair users. Now, during NCD's research, we received plentiful public comment highlighting the experiences that wheelchair users continue to encounter with inaccessible hotel shuttles. Many public comments we received emphasized the degrading, often humiliating treatment that wheelchair users experience and the significant disruption that this frequently creates in their travel plans with friends, family, or even work obligations. I'd like to relay one of those public comments that we received that is emblematic of many of the experiences we received in public comments, or of our own staff. One public comment submitted to NCD in July of 2023 describes the experience of wheelchair users who traveled to Washington, D.C. for a work conference as follows. Our flight was smooth, and we ordered an accessible shuttle from the hotel. Myself and another one of my coworkers both use wheelchairs, and another one of our coworkers uses a walker. And they shared the transportation was accessible, and we arrived there, and it was a giant Mercedes shuttle van with 4 steps to get in. So we asked if they could send something more accessible, which they were all flustered and didn't seem like it was going to happen. So we sat around in the hot sun, exhaust smog of the parking lot for 20 or 30 minutes, trying to figure out what we were going to do. And eventually we got sick of it. And my coworker and I had to crawl on the van of the floor and transfer into a seat that was there 3.5 feet in the air, in the process of which I hurt my shoulder because it was an awkward maneuver. And anybody who uses a wheelchair does transfers knows your shoulders are very, very important. And it's unfortunate. We did everything right. We ordered the accessible ride and we didn't get it. And we, felt like it was the 1970s all over again. We're crawling on the ground to do what we need to do. It was horrible. This is only one of many personal stories that NCD heard during our public comment. And these accessibility barriers are indeed violations of the shuttle provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. In NCD's research, the types of barriers we most commonly heard about regarding shuttle service were as follows. No accessible shuttle was available, and no equivalent service was made available. Accessible shuttles were not in operation, or the driver of the accessible shuttle who could operate the lift wasn't working or wasn't available. 24-hour notice requirements for equivalent service, an unwillingness on the part of a driver to assist when an accessible shuttle was available. Another theme we heard was that you simply cannot trust what you've read or have been told regarding the availability of an accessible shuttle. And all of this leads to anxiety, an emotional toll. It's very hard, regardless if you're traveling for business or pleasure, and especially if an employer is counting on you or your family's counting on you. And all of a sudden, the floor drops out when the shuttle isn't available to get you from the airport to your hotel or your next point of travel. So, what does the Americans with Disabilities Act require of shuttle services? Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act governs shuttle services provided by private entities. The types of shuttle services that private entities provide may include ones that are operated by private companies and shopping centers, student transportation systems, and services provided within recreational facilities like stadiums, zoos, amusement parks, and ski resorts. Private entities or public accommodations may operate fixed route or demand responsive shuttle service. The ADA has several distinctions when it comes to private entities that provide shuttle services. The first distinction under Title III that I will quickly mention is between fixed route shuttle service and demand responsive shuttle service. Fixed route service are those that operate on a set route and fixed schedule, whether a particular passenger is present or not. On a fixed route shuttle service, passengers do not need to take any action in order to initiate the service. An example of this would be a shuttle service from the airport that a hotel offers every 20 minutes, for instance. On the other hand, demand responsive shuttle service requires passengers to make requests to arrange their pickup. Second, the ADA distinguishes between shuttle services that do and do not primarily engage in the business of transporting people. Examples of entities that are not primarily engaged in transporting people include hotels, universities, amusement parks, and rental car businesses. These entities are considered to provide shuttle service to their passengers as merely a courtesy. Today, we're going to talk about the ADA's requirements on entities that provide shuttle services as a courtesy. For these entities, the ADA imposes the following specific requirements. First, private entities that provide fixed route shuttle service must ensure that any vehicle purchased or leased that seats more than 16 people is wheelchair accessible. If the vehicle seats 16 people or fewer, it must be wheelchair accessible unless equivalent service is provided. And as a reminder, equivalent service means that the service is available to people with disabilities, including wheelchair users, in an integrated setting and is equivalent to the service provided to people without disabilities regarding schedules and headways, fares, geographic areas of service, hours and days of service, availability of information, and any constraints on capacity or service availability. I'll briefly mention that the ADA does allow private entities to offer an equivalent service by contracting with a business that supplies wheelchair accessible vehicles and adheres to the 6 requirements that we just mentioned. Next, private entities that provide demand responsive shuttle service must ensure that vehicles purchased or leased that seat more than 16 people are wheelchair accessible and are equipped with a lift, unless they provide equivalent service as we just described. There is no wheelchair accessibility requirement for demand responsive shuttle service that uses vehicles that seat 16 or fewer people. Instead, the ADA requires that when viewed in its entirety, The system provides service to wheelchair users that is equivalent to the level of service provided to individuals without disabilities. So those are the legal requirements we've just reviewed, and those are for entities that are just providing shuttles as a courtesy, not as a primary business. On the other hand, private entities that are primarily engaged in providing transportation services have different requirements under the ADA. Next slide, please. First, when a private entity that is primarily engaged in the business of transporting people and that operates a fixed route transportation service purchases or leases a new vehicle other than an automobile or a van with a seating capacity of less than 8 passengers, including the driver, that vehicle must be readily accessible to individuals who use wheelchairs. If the private entity operates a demand-responsive system and purchases or leases a new vehicle other than an automobile, the vehicle must be readily accessible to individuals who use wheelchairs. Here again, the ADA provides the exception that says unless the system, when viewed in its entirety, meets the standard for equivalent service. Under the ADA, a fixed route system or a demand responsive one, when viewed in its entirety, provides that equivalent service if the service available to individuals with disabilities, which of course includes wheelchair users, is provided in the most integrated setting and is equivalent to the service provided other individuals with respect to the following factors. And again, you'll see the factors we mentioned before: schedules and headways. And by the way, headways is a term that means the time or distance between consecutive vehicles on the same route. And response time for demand responsive shuttles, fares, geographic areas of service, hours and days of service, availability of information, reservation capability, a requirement for demand responsive shuttles, any constraints on capacity or service availability, and finally, restrictions based on the trip's purpose, which is a requirement for demand responsive shuttles. Now, the DOJ, Department of Justice, has exclusive authority to enforce those provisions, and they have a duty to investigate alleged ADA violations. So to inform NCD's report, we sought data from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division about complaints it may have received about wheelchair access, pertaining specifically to shuttle service and rental car service, which we'll discuss next. DOJ responded that the Civil Rights Division receives thousands of citizen complaints through its online reporting portal, but it does not track disability complaints in a way that would allow it to respond to our question. And the division does not sort complaints as against transportation providers or by type of transportation provider. As a result, there isn't any available information on complaints about shuttle services or rental car companies regarding their lack of wheelchair accessible vehicles. So there's really no way to know how the division processes these complaints. What's more, as we mentioned during week 3 of our series, although the Department of Justice is responsible for enforcing Titles 2 and 3 ADA transportation regulation, its webpage, where ADA complaints may be submitted, does not contain any information recognizing a person's right to complain about disability discrimination by transportation providers. This omission may lead the public to believe that these are the only entities against which DOJ will accept a complaint, which would discourage the public from seeking relief from discrimination by inaccessible taxis, public transit, or shuttle services, or by discrimination by rental car companies, not to mention TNCs like Uber and Lyft. So we want to again highlight that concern at this briefing. It's a real concern, and it will connect to a recommendation we have at the end of today. The inability to obtain this data from DOJ prevented its inclusion in the report. However, a search of published settlements revealed there has been no recent enforcement activity by DOJ in this area, despite the pervasiveness of problems that NCD heard about this area of transportation from across the country. Now, let's turn our attention to barriers that wheelchair users encounter when they reserve rental cars. NCD received numerous public comment expressing frustration from wheelchair users who continue to experience difficulty reserving rental cars with hand controls. These barriers exist at each step of the rental car process, even though the Department of Justice has settled complaints against car rental companies since the enactment of the ADA. To provide a clearer picture for our audience today, I'll describe comments that NCD received from the CEO of Paralyzed Veterans of America, who is a manual wheelchair user and travels extensively. In his experience, you cannot get the full variety of cars available to non-disabled drivers, and oftentimes, when he would arrive to pick up his rental car, he was told either that his vehicle with hand controls had been given away, that a person who knows how to install the hand controls doesn't work on the weekend, or that the company doesn't have his reservation and can't accommodate his request. PVA analyzed 3 major rental car companies and compared the vehicles they offered and their reservation process, and found inequalities with all of them, including 2 to 3 days advance reservation requirements for hand controls, and no guarantee that you will receive the vehicle type or model that you reserved. Undoubtedly, some lead time is needed in order to install hand controls, but 2 to 3 days is excessive given the research and case law, which have determined that an hour is a reasonable amount of time needed to install hand controls. It's worth briefly mentioning here that as more automobile manufacturers begin installing airbags underneath the steering wheel to protect the knees and legs during a collision, car rental agencies were temporarily unable to install hand controls without disabling these airbags because of a provision in the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which prohibited a rental company from knowingly making inoperative any part of a safety feature of a vehicle unless it received an exemption from NHTSA. However, in order to help make rental cars available to people who require hand controls, in March of 2022, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration resolved this problem. They did this by issuing a federal rule that allows rental car companies to disable a knee bolster airbag on a temporary basis to permit the temporary installation of hand controls. This is to say, this is no longer an issue. In February 2024, disability rights advocates filed a class action lawsuit in the Northern District of California against Hertz Rental Car, alleging systemic ADA violations against people with disabilities who need hand controls to operate a rental car. According to their complaint, plaintiffs found that although there were many models of hand controls on the market that can be installed in virtually any car, Hertz had limited the models of vehicles that it offered with this accessibility feature. Furthermore, Hertz adopted a policy to refuse to install hand controls in certain categories of vehicles altogether. Specifically, this policy excluded people who needed hand controls from renting electric vehicles, convertibles, luxury sedans, and a variety of other vehicle categories that it offered to the company's non-disabled customers. Hertz would also not allow customers to reserve a minivan, truck, or sedan with hand controls. In other words, the only vehicles actually available to plaintiffs was some type of SUV. The irony here is that the height of most SUVs makes them extremely difficult or even impossible for people who use wheelchairs to climb into safely without assistance. This is all to say that Hertz gave plaintiffs an unrealistic vehicle option and denied them the full and equal enjoyment of its goods and services as required under the ADA. Plaintiffs also alleged that Hertz imposed an impermissible surcharge on customers with disabilities, who were forced to pay the difference in daily rate between the car they wanted to rent and the car that Hertz would allow them to rent with hand controls. It was not uncommon for the cheapest car that Hertz provided with hand controls to cost as much as $100 more than the cheapest car non-disabled customers had access to. Hertz's online reservation system only offered hand controls on higher-priced vehicles, again, limiting the categories of vehicles available to wheelchair users. In addition, they alleged that the company's website did not clearly indicate which vehicles can be reserved with hand controls. This resulted in customers who required hand controls to engage in a lengthy and frustrating process of trial and error in order to figure out which vehicles had this as an option. Title III of the ADA governs rental car companies, and the Department of Justice enforces these discrimination complaints. However, NCD's research found that the most recent DOJ action against the rental car company and their refusal to provide hand controls in rental cars is 30 years old, according to their website. In this 1994 case, the Department of Justice entered into a settlement agreement with Avis Rental Car, resolving allegations that Avis had violated the Americans with Disabilities Act by failing to provide disabled renters with hand-controlled vehicles for the full range of vehicles that Avis made available to the general public, meaning that these renters were limited in their options of vehicles to choose from that were equipped with hand controls that could enable them to drive. Which sounds a lot like the class action lawsuit against Hertz we just reviewed, which of course is 30 years later since the Avis settlement agreement. And unfortunately, that sort of showcases that widespread improvements in accessible rental cars for wheelchair users remains elusive many, many years later. Based on the numerous public comments that NCD received and the class action lawsuit describing the experiences of people with disabilities, NCD requested information from DOJ's Civil Rights Division on the number and types of ADA complaints it had received against rental car companies during the past several years. But, like we mentioned previously, DOJ responded to NCD during the creation of this report when we sought the data and told us that though they receive thousands of complaints each year through their reporting portal, they don't track disability complaints in a way that would let them sort by transportation provider. So, like we mentioned before with shuttle service, as a result, there isn't any available information that we can share about complaints that DOJ may have received about rental car companies. Before we turn to our policy recommendations on this topic, I would like to summarize a few final conclusions on the experiences of people with mobility disabilities and shuttle service and rental car service. Anecdotally, evidence of extensive non-compliance with shuttle service ADA requirements exists. Anecdotally, evidence of extensive non-compliance with rental car ADA requirements continues to exist. And while DOJ receives complaints, has the authority to enforce and a duty to investigate violations of ADA requirements for both shuttle service and rental car service, it does not appear to have done much enforcement activity in either area in many, many years, despite the significance of both modes of transportation as critical linkages in travel plans. Let's now turn our discussion to the future and NCD's recommendations on ways to improve shuttle service and rental car service for wheelchair users. Because we really don't want to be having this briefing again in 10 years and talking about these things as continuing to remain unchanged. So first, NCD recommends that the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division should vigorously enforce the ADA when private entities such as hotels, rental car companies, and shuttle services, including shuttles offered by transportation network companies, fail to provide wheelchair-accessible shuttles. During NCD's research, we found a significant gap in disability data at the DOJ, which was unable to provide even basic data on transportation discrimination complaints filed with its Civil Rights Division, such as the number of complaints, the type of transportation provider that allegedly discriminated, the discriminatory act alleged, or the complaint status, leaving a void of enforcement data on discrimination by hotels and rental car companies. For this reason, NCD recommends that DOJ should improve its online ADA complaint webpage to add transportation as one of the explicit topics for which a complaint can be submitted. Currently, transportation is not even mentioned on their webpage, although DOJ is charged with enforcing both Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA, transportation regulation. Without access to this information, people who do not know the scope of DOJ's enforcement authority may logically assume that transportation complaints are not even accepted by them. The Civil Rights Division should include in its annual report to Congress the number of complaints it receives alleging transportation discrimination broken down by ADA title, the type of discrimination alleged, and the entity that allegedly discriminated. This will assist in policy planning and in interventions based on trends and persistent barriers that are indicated by the complaints. Next, and related to the recommendation about DOJ's ADA complaint webpage, NCD recommends that the Department of Justice should also improve its ADA complaint intake system so that it can search for and track civil rights complaints by ADA title, the type of accommodation or entity that allegedly discriminated, and the discriminatory act alleged. It should also be able to track complaint status, such as accepted, dismissed, with grounds for dismissal, or mediated. This information is necessary to enable DOJ to provide transparent, improved data to Congress, federal agencies, and the public on the implementation of its ADA enforcement authority, and to track the types of allegations received, inform enforcement strategy at the agency level, and help determine regulatory and guidance needs that may exist. Relatedly, NCD recommends that DOJ should publish annual reports of the number of complaints filed under Titles 2 and 3, including transportation provider type and the type of discrimination that was alleged. Finally, NCD recommends that the Department of Justice should publish an easy-to-understand document on the duty of shuttles to provide wheelchair-accessible vehicles or equivalent service and how passengers can file complaints. We believe that this is an appropriate step in view of what we've outlined today. We have reached the end of our 6-part series on ground transportation and people with mobility disabilities. During these past 6 weeks, and despite one of the key areas the Americans with Disabilities Act aimed to address, which was the removal of barriers in transportation for people with disabilities, we have clearly documented how significantly transportation disadvantaged people with mobility disabilities remain across transportation options, particularly those with motorized wheelchairs and scooters. And we explored how those disadvantages have ripple effects into all areas of daily life, from employment to healthcare to being there for one's kids. When you cannot just get up and go, or even just rely upon others who are supposed to help you get up and go, everything in daily living is upended. It's no wonder then why people with mobility disabilities are disproportionately and underemployed, disproportionately in poverty and multi-generational poverty, and disproportionately don't leave their homes. To change this persistent and present reality, NCD clearly documented the benefit of a policy environment that combines legal and regulatory requirements with incentives and funding, along with robust enforcement and strong data. NCD underscored numerous examples of private-public partnerships, paving the way for some encouraging successes and true innovation. And we underscored the need to foster innovation with a flexible regulatory environment, but not at the expense of some base expectations and standards, so that people with mobility disabilities are included at the design phase of new technology and not again left to costly and time-lagging retrofits after the fact. Right now, the success stories NCD has shared are the exception, bucking the trend of significant disadvantages for people with mobility disabilities. But they do provide a powerful look into what the future could hold if policymakers embrace NCD's reasoned advisement. Thanks again for joining us for a discussion on how to improve the ground transportation realities for people with mobility disabilities. We hope you've learned a lot during this series, and we'll take the opportunity to review NCD's report in full. It is available on NCD's website at www.ncd.gov, and a video of each of the 6 parts of this briefing series will also be posted to NCD's website in coming weeks. We invite you to revisit any of the material at your leisure. For now, we wish you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you and goodbye.